Right, hello everybody, I'm Grandmaster Robert Hungaski, and today I'm going to be doing a class, Prepare Like a Pro. So for this class, what I thought I'd do is share a recent game where I got a chance to play some of the preparation that I had in mind. Right? So a lot of the times it happens, you think you know what your opponent's going to play, you prep this whole line, and then something completely unexpected happens. But a few times, we actually get exactly what we were hoping for. And this was the case for me. Not to say that all the problems are solved, but it's kind of interesting to see how the expectation of getting a position actually measures up to getting it. And this game was played at the Continental Championship a couple weeks ago in the Dominican Republic. My opponent was legendary Grandmaster from Colombia, Alonzo Zapata. It's a very famous game where he beat Anand in 15 moves. And during the 1980s, he was one of the strongest players in Latin America. So he's always been an E4 player, and he is a Sicilian player himself. So a Sicilian I had been dabbling in recently was the Sicilian, and Zapata's probably the guy that knows the most about that Sicilian in the world. So I wasn't going to try that. But there was another Sicilian in the back of my mind that I had been wanting to try for a while because I had seen a very nice game that Anish Giri won with black. And I also noticed Makshudlu playing this variation a lot, and that is the Kalashnikov Sicilian. I think the Sicilian is a very popular opening because it's so dynamic. It's not easy for white to to find dry positions with which to kind of kill the game. Most anti-Sicilians are not great. And within the Sicilian, you can choose from so many different options. I mean, in this game, we'll be talking about the Kalashnikov, but you have the other lesser-known Sicilians like the Löwenthal, the O'Kelly variation. Then you have the Dragon family. You have the Najdorf, the Scheveningen structures, the Conwell. It's quite rich. But the interesting thing about the Sicilian is that they all share the same DNA. They all want to arrive at the same position, right? By trading the C pawn for the D pawn, black has secured himself a pawn majority in the center, and that's exactly where our play is going to be. Sometimes we associate the Sicilian with these crazy dragon games, or Bobby Fischer or Kasparov's Najdorfs, or Topolov's Najdorfs, Scheveningen structures, and we forget that there's actually a very simple idea going on here, and it's going on in the center. So the Löwenthal variation has always been one of my favorite openings. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it here. I would really like to dedicate an entire lecture to it if I could. But the idea of the Löwenthal is actually the most straightforward way that we can carry out this plan. Because if white plays a passive move like knight b3, then after knight f6, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop d3, our dream setup comes true. And black is already better here. The same, or I guess analogous approach is the O'Kelly variation. This is probably even sharper because black doesn't even want to give white the option of going knight b5, right? So now if knight b3, bishop b4, bishop d3, we get a very similar, almost identical dream setup. So this is how the Sicilian was born. These are the oldest Sicilians, the Löwenthal, the O'Kelly. And everything has built from there. I mean, today the most popular Sicilian of all is, you could call it a Löwenthal or an O'Kelly variation improved, because black is taking all these precautions so that when the move e5 is played, there is no check on b5, there is no knight b5, and hopefully the d5 pawn break can be prepared and carried out. So that's really where everything sort of meets the common denominator. Now in this game, I played knight c6, and after takes, e5, knight b5, I decided to play the Kalashnikov variation because I noticed my opponent didn't have that many games in it, and the games that he did have all featured the move c4, which is the move that almost everybody plays against the Kalashnikov. And it's a perfectly good move, of course. I mean, it makes so much sense. Look at how white is on point here. White recognizes the importance of the d5 square and engages us in this tug of war. And with the move c4, white is basically saying, just forget about d5. It's never going to happen. And the alternative, knight 1 to c3, is also quite interesting. I'm not really going to get into it too much here, partly because I don't think I know it as well as c4. And really, for me, the game started after the move c4. I was 99% sure this is what my opponent would play, and he did. So after c4, the first obstacle in the game needs to be overcome. Like, what are we going to do about this clamp? Well, the Maroczy bind is not just a structure that's relevant in the Kalashnikov. It's one of the most important pawn structures in all of chess strategy. And it's even present in queen pawn openings, although there it's referred to as same-ish structures, but they're very similar. In the Sicilian, usually once white sets up this clamp, black is going to have to try to chip away at it from the sides. Right? We need to deflect the E and or the C pawns so that white will loosen his grip over this d5 square, and we can finally get back to what matters. So after bishop e6, knight c3, a6, knight a3, this is more or less the standard Kalashnikov position. I mean, this move bishop e6, it's not the only way of playing. I remember that for a while after a6, knight a3, black was trying to move f5 right away. So this move makes a lot of sense because black is chipping away at white's Maroczy bind, right? So now we can play maybe knight f6, bishop e7, castles, and then aim for b5. Very interesting. I haven't looked at it in a while, but I suspect there must be some pretty big problem with it. And the other idea that I've seen is bishop e7 trying to trade off these bishops. So usually trading off these dark square bishops in Maroczy bind structures, not a bad idea. But I had something else in mind with bishop e6. That was that after knight c3, a6, knight a3, I wanted to play this idea. And this is the idea that I was mentioning Maqsood and Guri had essayed with great success. Maqsood actually played it a whole bunch of times against very strong players with great results. Now, let's see if that Guri game has made it to the Lichess database. It should have. Let's see. Anand Maqsood, that's a good one too. I'll insert that one. But anyway, the point of g6 might seem like, oh, I'm just trying to put a bishop on g7 and a knight on d4. And while that is true, like there are many situations where I would definitely do that, I'm also preparing the idea of f5 in order to meet e takes f5 with g takes f5. So I don't just want to trade off your pawn on e4, I want to bring my g pawn into the discussion as well. And what's interesting about this preparation that I'm going to be sharing with you is that it's not really about memorization. Understanding when to play f5 is going to depend more on your understanding of the position than your ability to memorize moves. Although you could just memorize your way through it, it's not going to be the easiest and most productive way. So my opponent plays knight c2, makes a lot of sense, covering the d4 square. And now after bishop g7, this was a key moment in the game. And actually, something very curious happened while I was playing this game, was that I started seeing moves that hadn't even occurred to me in my preparation. I assumed white was just going to play bishop e3, bishop e2, and castle kingside, maybe queen d2, rook fd1, f3, rook ac1. Those were sort of the moves I had in mind. But it turns out that there's a big difference in which move we start with. And when I started to understand that, I actually realized that probably white's best move here is knight d5, because this is going to be the central piece of the puzzle. And the reason knight d5 is annoying is, well, if I take on d5, after c takes, knight d4, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop d3, this could actually be a playable position. Black could try to go knight d7, castles, rook e8, knight c5, rook c8. But these positions do tend to be slightly better for white. For example, I don't know, castle, let's see. Yeah, maybe if instead of castles I go knight d7 first, this could be better. Yeah, but f4, knight c5, maybe b4 takes. And these kinds of positions, the d4 pawn is going to suffer a little bit. So, okay, playable, absolutely. So, once I saw, okay, knight d5 is not such a big deal. Also, knight d5 doesn't really threaten anything. I could just go rook c8 first, and I don't think that's going to change anything. But what did seem kind of interesting to me was that I couldn't play knight f6 or knight g7 too comfortably because of bishop g5. And this was a problem. So knight d5, we can take on d5 or play rook c8, but we have to be very careful with knight f6. So then I said, okay, that's taken care of. What about castling quickly? This is actually the moment where I realized, okay, f5 is kind of delicate, because you would think that after bishop e2, f5 would be very interesting, because after takes, the queen can't come to h5, right? Maybe the bishop will give a check, but actually after king f8, the king is quite safe on f8, and the bishop on h5 is nothing to write home about. My next move is going to be knight f6, and maybe queen c7, knight e7, rook c8, b5. This knight can come to g6, king f7. These pawns are mobile. So this is exactly the kind of position I was aiming for. But this turns out to be quite dubious for black, because there is one fundamental idea, and this is what's going to determine the success or failure of f5, and that is the move b3. And now this bishop's coming to a3, and white is going to really sink his teeth into the d6 pawn. For example, after knight f6, bishop a3, knight takes, queen takes, and I don't know, something like queen c7, for example, castle queenside. And this is just such an annoying pressure, right? Maybe just f4, and the bishop on a3 is just killing our position. So rule of thumb is f5 not going to work if the bishop can go to a3. So we really want to wait for the bishop to come to e3 before we even pull the trigger on this f5 move. And that was pretty much the extent of my preparation. So when my opponent played bishop e3 here, I was like, okay, time to go f5. And this was also quite impulsive of me, because it's not enough that the bishop can't come to a3. Avoiding a queen coming to h5 is pretty important. So really, I hadn't appreciated how important of a waiting move rook c8 is, because after rook c8, you're kind of keeping the position flexible. You don't know if the knight's coming this way or this way to try to support knight d4, knight ec6. You don't know when f5 is coming, if at all. Maybe b5 is going to be an idea. And you can't just waste tempi like crazy as white. So, if you go bishop e2, now I get the best possible version. One where there's no bishop a3 and one where there's no queen h5. So now, for example, after something like castle kingside, well, your c4 pawn is hanging, right? So you would have to take some precautions, and here this knight is looking a little shaky. Maybe I can go knight f6, knight e7, and b5. I don't know, knight f6. Castles. And maybe just here. And try to go b5 if you go a4. Maybe I just go d5. And we finally made it, right? We carried out the d5 pawn break. It took a while, took hard work, but we did it. And now, let's say takes. Yeah, this has to be a dream come true for black. Okay, so that is really the position that we're aiming at, and it's very possible that you can get it because white has made nothing but natural moves so far. So it turns out after rook c8, it's probably best to go something like queen d2, and after f5, takes, and castles, right? And just go for the pressure on d6. Even though we can't get the bishop involved, at least the queen will, right? And the point is that after f4, takes. If you take on e3, I'll take on e6. And if you go king e7, now the bishop's going to get rerouted once again to its ideal diagonal, which ironically is a3, f8. And that's the one non-obvious detail that I think every opening has. Like when you study an opening, you really need to find that nugget of an idea that kind of changes the evaluation, right? That once your opponent sees it, he's like, oh, this is not as easy as I thought. So anyway, I looked at this position. The engine was recommending knight f6, just sacrificing this pawn, which is actually a pretty interesting idea because when I look at this, I feel like, oh, I'm just down a pawn, but it turns out black has considerable compensation. I mean, knight a5, b5 is a thing, e4, f4 is a thing, knight g4, bishop f8, maybe just rook d8. So tremendous piece activity. So going back, I neglected to include rook c8 and played f5 right away. And almost immediately my opponent played check and castled queenside. And this was actually pretty, I think, a good decision by my opponent because he's really optimizing the pressure on the d file. And this queen, I underestimated how annoying this queen really was going to be on h5 because I figured, well, I'm just going to develop my knight with tempo. But there are a couple of problems in this position that are more serious than they appear. The first is the d6 pawn. White is actually threatening bishop c5, and even if black doesn't win the pawn on d6, just rerouting the bishop to a3 is a huge accomplishment because this bishop on e3 is misplaced. In fact, the knight would like to come to e3 and d5 or start putting pressure on f5. And if I go, well, I did go knight f6, right? White's going to go queen h4, and now there are two problems. One is, again, bishop coming to c5, but the other has to do with our king safety, because it might not look like it, but this is a fianchetto, right? It's been a bumpy ride for this fianchetto. A lot has happened, but all of the same principles apply. And in my lecture the other day, when we were discussing the Benoni structures, I was mentioning how in order to demolish a fianchetto, there are basically three things that need to happen. One, you need to chase away the main defender of the fianchetto, of the king side, which is the knight on f6. Number two, use the hook on g6 to open up the h-file. That also seems fairly difficult and unlikely in this position since there is no pawn on g6. And last but not least, trade off the fianchettoed bishop. So White's going to have a really hard time doing the first of these two things, but the other one's going to be really easy, right? The whole point of this incursion of the queen is to trade off the dark square bishops, right? So here I played queen c7, making sure that bishop c5 didn't happen, and I got hit with bishop h6. So queen takes f6 is a huge threat. I can't, if I take on h6, well, that's check, right? So after queen takes, queen g7, the queens get traded off, and then I lose my pawn on d6. That's bad. So I have to stop queen f6. Therefore, I played king f7, and now after takes, and knight e3. So this trade was an important accomplishment for white, and my position is really on the razor's edge here. Now, that's within acceptable parameters if we play the Kalashnikov in such an aggressive way. But something has gone wrong. And really, the lesson I took away from this game was that allowing this queen to give a check on h5 means that white's going to be able to trade off my dark square bishop. And I think that's what put me at a disadvantage here. And now I have to treat the position with great care. Already I can't do what I would like to do, which is to play b5, because white is threatening a very nasty tactic with queen takes f6 followed by knight d5, right? Takes, and white simply takes the queen and remains up a piece. So I played the move knight e7, very important move, covers d5, so makes sure that queen takes f6 is not happening, clears the c file, and prepares at some point the move knight g6. Although I need to be very careful, because if I were to play knight g6 on the next move, I would fall for queen takes f6 again. So I was actually starting to feel pretty good about my position. I was thinking, well, you know, b5 is coming, queen c5 maybe, maybe king f7, rook g8, h5, and then knight g6. Like, if I could really consolidate that king side, I might just win the game there. So after knight e7, my opponent played a very strong move. And after this move, I knew I was in trouble. Right? Played g4. And this leaves me no choice but to take the pawn. If I leave the pawn on f5, white's just going to take and go rook g1. That seems terrible. Maybe even queen g5. If I go f4, I'm going to get hit with this in-between move. Right? I mean, there's a check here that's coming. There's takes. I would have to go knight g8. And now maybe just knight d5. Takes. I mean, what is this? Queen, bishop d3 is coming. I can't move my knight because of queen h6. Maybe rook d1, king b1. Yeah. Black is pretty much busted here. So I have to take on g4. And now h3. It's clear that I should never ever allow the g file to get open, right? If I go g takes h3, there doesn't necessarily need to be a forced sequence, you know, check, check, and checkmate. But simply bishop takes h3, trade off the light square bishops, bring the rook to the g file, play like a Banco gambit, where instead of pawns, your king is there. And it's not too hard to see that this is not going to end well for black. So have to go h5. And now, after bishop d3, I have to be very careful, because now the bishop's trying to get involved in the kingside attack, which is actually not such a big deal. But what is a big deal is the other. Okay, I can't really go knight g6, again because of queen takes f6, but also queen g5 might be an idea, knight f5 might be an idea, bishop f5 might be an idea. But the real point behind bishop d3 is to resume this dismantling of black's kingside fianchetto. I mean, it looks like there's nothing left of that fianchetto. The pawn on g6 is gone, the bishop on g7 is gone, but there's one thing left, and that is that knight on f6, and it's the only thing keeping this king alive. So the point of bishop d3 is actually to play knight to e4. And after knight to e4, trade off these knights, and the queen will just do tremendous damage. For example, if I had played something like, no, not rook f8. If I had played b5, right, which was one of the big moves that I wanted to play, then white was going to go knight e4. And after knight takes, bishop takes. Now the rook is getting hit, queen g5 is coming. It's a very scary position. Maybe I can barely hold on with d5, but it's scary. It says bishop c2, and the attack continues. So it's a scary position, and I said, well, let me just get my king out of this situation. It anticipates any kind of check on g5, and most importantly, I'm engaging white in this tug of war. We call this the thread of the game, right? There's finally something that is of mutual interest to both white and black, enough so that we're going to struggle over it, right? This is pretty much the essence of the thread of the game, finding the main idea that should guide your play so that you can arrive at the right move. So the question is, well, why does this stop knight e4 at all? Well, because now, after knight takes, bishop takes, d5 turns out to be much stronger. Having played king f7 instead of b5, it's a huge improvement. Right? I get out of the checks, get out of the g file, protect my knight. We're doing great. Bishop c2, now I just go d4, and I'm just going to keep pushing your pieces back, and your c4 pawn is going to have some issues. So white stays on the thread, right? You need to think of the thread of the game as that mechanical bull, right? That we're holding on to, and it's trying to throw us off, and we can't let distractions take our eye off the ball. So white plays a very good move, king b1. And this renews the idea of knight e4, right? If we go b5, knight e4, knight takes, bishop takes. Now there's no d5 because there's no pin along the c file. Here, I had originally gone into the position because I saw this move that I liked, which I ended up playing, which makes a lot of sense because after queen c6, it seems like that's it. The fight for e4 is over. If you take on g4, takes, this kind of material imbalance is not going to be a problem for black as long as the knight is on f6, because otherwise rook h1, rook h7 would be devastating. But this is why it was so important for white to try to trade off this knight on f6, because then all of the ideas with hg4 followed by queen h8 are going to work quite nicely. For example, let's say if I bring this rook to g8 and white goes knight e4, and now after knight takes, bishop takes, let's say I go b5, pawn takes, pawn takes. Now there's no knight on c3 and no knight on f6. So after takes, 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 let's say b takes c4, rook d to h1, and this was one of the variations I saw during the game and which got me very worried because I was like, oh, wait a minute, rook h7 is devastating, right? If I go queen a5, check, king f6, check, king g5, at the very least, I would have to calculate, well, what happens if rook takes e7? Do I have perpetual? Like, would I be lucky enough to get a draw here? And I don't think so. I think after takes, check, king c2 here, probably just king c1. And you can even give up the bishop because you're going to pick up the bishop on e6. So anyway, it looked like once the knights come off, the levies about to break. So I played queen c6, and the moment I played queen c6, it was one of those, it happens a lot, you know, that you have this moment of clarity when it's too late, once you've made your move. And when I thought the fight for e4 was over, I realized white has this unbelievable move, f3. If queen takes f3, then simply rook f1, and after queen takes e3, queen takes f6, followed by queen takes e6 or queen takes h8, and that's pretty much over. If I do nothing, white's just going to play knight e4, and if I take with the pawn, the point is that the queen is now assisting the knight to come to e4. So after knight e4, knight takes, bishop takes, let's say queen c5. This is just a nightmare because the f-file is going to open. Like, I was really counting on that not happening. I mean, I'll be lucky to reroute my king over to the queen side, but I don't know, something like, I remember during the game, it was really funny because it looked like I had almost a resignable position after rook f1. But it turns out that after queen takes e3, rook takes f3, instead of resigning, I could also play knight f5, which turns out to be an unbelievably strong move. Because if bishop takes f5, I'll take on f3, and black is actually winning. If rook takes e3, I'll take on h4, still winning. And well, if rook takes f5, just bishop takes, and after bishop takes, black is up in exchange. I think I can even trade queens here with queen f4. The game is also over. So that's kind of a cute move, but of course white doesn't have to go into any of this. White can just trade off the knight, keep stripping the black king of its defenders, and I don't know, for example, if knight takes, pawn takes, bishop d7, now rook f1, and who's going to stop the white rooks from just demolishing my position, right? This is a winning attack. So f3 was pretty much winning in this position, and to my great relief, being in severe time trouble, my opponent played knight c to d5 fairly quickly. And this is a huge blunder. I mean, this is one of those moments where you feel like, okay, you know, that my opponent is the first one to let go of the threat of the game. Because now with the knight on f6 secure, I can play with pretty much the peace of mind that my king is never going to get into trouble. So now white decides to go for this variation with the knight on f6, and it turns out to be a completely different story. So after queen a4, rook b8, queen f4, rook takes b7. A couple of really interesting tactics need to be attended to before we go on this pawn-grabbing expedition on f2, which of course is going to open up an avenue for the g-pawn to promote. But if black takes on f2 right away, then knight f5, and that's not going to end well. And if I play e4, which I did, right, this is going to attack the bishop and take away the f5 square. After bishop takes a6, I still can't take on f2 because of another nice tactic, which is knight takes g4, counting on knight takes and rook f1. And white is actually winning now. So the key here is to switch up the order of the moves. Instead of going queen takes f2 followed by g3, I can actually start with g3, because f takes is going to be met with queen takes e3. And otherwise, I'm just going to take on f2 with the pawn, and that's going to serve several purposes. First of all, I'm going to keep the f-file closed. I'm big on that. Secondly, my pawn is getting closer and closer to promoting. We now have two connected passed pawns, and they're supported by the queen and soon both knights. So after rook f1 takes, rook b3, of course, moving this knight back would just allow me to play e3. But now that my knight is unpinned, it's going to cooperate as well. So knight d1, and here the game just unfolds very nicely, right? Bishop e2, knight e4, threatening this triple fork, and after rook b7, king f6, rook h1. Here, black just wins by force, right? Check here and queen e4. And since I'm threatening queen b1 mate as well as queen takes h1 and there are no checks, well, my opponent just resigned. So anyway, this is one of the opening ideas that I've been working on that I was lucky enough to actually get it in my game. And even when I got it, I couldn't quite wrap my head around the details in my preparation, but maybe in like 2 minutes of having it over the board, all of these things just start jumping out at you, like the importance of the timing of f5, and that it's not just about the bishop not coming to a3, but also the queen not coming to h5. So we're going to do one more opening. Let's see. So that's the Sicilian. What do we have here? Oh. Where's the French defense? Here we go. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the French defense. I play the French defense a lot with black, and I actually recently started enjoying playing against it with white. And usually I play this move knight c3, but also e5, the advanced variation, is probably the most aggressive, most practical way that you can play against the French defense. And theory isn't as excited about white's position after e5 as it is about, let's say, knight c3. But in any case, this game featured knight c3, and I knew my opponent would normally play bishop b4. In fact, my opponent's a FIDE master from Uruguay, and I had played him once before in a blitz game, and he had played bishop b4 against me, and I think I played e5, and it was a crazy game. But this time around, I decided I was going to surprise him, that I was going to choose a move that wouldn't allow him to get the kind of position that a Winawer player is usually looking for, right? And those kinds of positions are pretty easy to figure out, what they are, because this is the main tabia of the Winawer. And I would say if you had to define the Winawer in one sentence, it would be get the king over to the queen side, right? If black is able to play queen a5, knight c6, bishop d7, castle queenside c4, black has nothing to worry about. The problem is when this king gets stranded in the center, or even worse, the king side. So, moves like queen a5, queen a4 are very popular these days. Also knight c6, queen a5, bishop d7, castles is something I've played on occasion, which I think is also quite interesting. And then, of course, you have the knight e7, queen g4, queen c7 pawn sacrifice line, which I don't even know what's going on there. So I was like, I don't think I can prepare all of that in one night. So I played knight e2, which has the simple idea of never letting black double our pawns, right? And if we have to pay the price of a pawn on e4 to achieve that, then so be it. Because now after a3, bishop takes, knight takes. If you really want to cling to this pawn, let's say if you want to play something like f5, your dark squares are not getting any better. For example, I'm not even going to stress this pawn right now. I'm just going to play bishop f4, let's say knight f6, queen d2, castles, and castles. And the secret to this variation, again, it doesn't have anything to do with memorizing a bunch of long lines, but instead is understanding that it's all about opposite color bishops. When you play this knight g2 line, you are very likely to end up in an opposite color bishop middle game, and that's the kind of position that you're going to have to know how to handle. For example, I don't know, if black goes b6, trying to get a bishop to b7, I could play bishop c4. Let's go queen e7. Well, then just d5 is tremendous. But even if I couldn't go d5, these kinds of positions where we embrace and accept the pawn deficit, but we open up the e file and we start drilling on this pawn on e6, or maybe put a rook, the d rook on e1, the other one on g1. I don't know, something like this. Black is completely busted. So hanging on to the pawn is one of the worst things that you can do as black, especially if you play f5, weakening your e6 pawn. If you go knight f6, it's really not as bad, but I will go bishop g5, and if h6, bishop here, castles, knight takes e4. If you do something like knight bd7, I'm going to play moves like bishop d3, queen f3, castle queenside. Those tend to be unpleasant positions for black as well. So instead, black comes up with an active defense, and that is to counterattack the pawn on d4 instead of defending e4 directly. Because now if I go knight takes e4, queen takes d4, and what are we even talking about? Black just has a crushing position. So the reason I played this variation, I played this with black sometimes, and I thought the main move here was d5, and an interesting sideline was bishop b5. But when I saw the next move, I was like, I have to try this. And it's a beautiful move. It's a move bishop f4, and I like it because it's a recurring move in the position, which makes it gives it a little extra value, in my opinion. When you see a move that keeps popping up over and over again, like this bishop seems to always want to go to f4. And here, even though black can capture d4 in two different ways, both captures lose. Because the point of bishop f4 is that I'm threatening knight b5. It seems like a very simple threat, but it's actually very annoying, because if you play a6, then I'll go d5, and after pawn takes, I'm going to reach your c7 pawn this way, and you can't defend it. So black, you might think, well, I'll just go queen takes d4, but then you run into knight b5. And if queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and again, there's no defense to knight takes c7. If you go knight takes d4, now I have bishop e5, threatening d4 and g7. And when you move your knight away from d4, then again, you get hit with knight b5, with a completely winning position. So it's a great little opening trap. My opponent played the main move here, knight f6, which is a very important move because it's not just about defending e4, but instead about reacting in this threat of the game, which is the threat of knight b5, by countering with knight d5, not just defending c7, but also attacking f4. So black has managed to neutralize our knight b5 idea, but here is where I think the real essence of the position starts to reveal itself, because after bishop b5, we are setting up a trade that's going to set up the main theme of the middle game. And as we'll see, that's going to be the opposite color bishop. So after bishop d7, now d5, takes, right? Threatening c7, so takes, threatening e4, so castles. Now if I take rook e8, and here we reach another key moment in the game. I remember I actually played this in a blitz game, in a couple blitz games, and I always used to play castle queenside. And this allows black to play queen f6, which is a nice way of sort of untangling on the d file, because if queen takes d7, queen takes f4, king b1, rook d8, all of a sudden black has everything covered. And black is up a pawn, and black has got pretty good pressure. And if I go bishop e3, then another nice active move, bishop g4 followed by rook d8. So this move is key, right? Pushing the queen further back into its own camp. And after queen c8, only then castle queenside. So the bishop's actually really annoying on g5. It controls d8. It forced the queen to a very passive square. And now I don't really need to do anything too special. I could just take this pawn and centralize my rooks and enjoy my bishop pair, right? And my better development and my better king safety. So black really doesn't want to let go of that e4 pawn. So he plays bishop f5 and allows me to take the pawn on c6 instead, right? And this is within sort of the plan, right? This is part of the plan, getting this opposite color bishop position. So after rook e8, rook d4, rook b8, rook d1. I'm threatening rook d8, so black plays h6, give his king a little bit of breathing room, and now bishop e3. And this position is very interesting because I think that I misevaluated at some point. At some point I lost the thread of the game. We'll see when exactly that was and how I was able to sort of claw my way back. But what I didn't understand at the time was how good the endgames are for white. In fact, white's main plan in this position is to trade queens. It might not seem obvious because you think, well, when you have opposite color bishops on the board, the important thing is to seize the initiative, to be the first one. And here white's bishop looks better than black's bishop, but that's not really true. It's not going to be easy to make progress as white without moving this bishop away from e3, and that's always going to allow black e3 ideas himself. Not to mention, black has a worse pawn structure, right? This isn't necessarily a bad thing. The worse pawn structure usually means that you have greater potential for piece activity, right? So when you start hearing, okay, opposite color bishops, greater potential for piece activity, this should be a red flag going off saying, I got to bail out of this before it gets out of control. So I didn't realize how important trading queens here was. And instead, after king h7, I played rook a4, bishop g6, and here I was still pretty much on the thread because I wasn't in a hurry to play rook takes a7, although there would have been nothing wrong with this. I think my opponent wanted to go queen g4, but I think even here after g3, I don't know, rook d8. Yeah, this kind of scared me a little bit during the game. I felt like, what's my rook doing here? Apparently, Stockfish just laughs at you, plays b4 and puts the king on b2 and says, game over. Fair enough, because your bishop is dead, right? So this would have probably been the most clean-cut way of approaching it. But I decided to play rook d7 and sort of pick up the thread that was begun with bishop g5, right, of dominating the queen on c8. And not to mention still threatening to take on c7. So now, after rook b7, here is where I lost the thread of the game. I let go and the mechanical bull just kicked me right off because this is not about pawns. As long as the queens are on the board, it's not about pawns. It's about piece activity. And it looks like black is just tied down. Like all the black pieces seem passive. Maybe rook e6 is the only idea. And that's why, very tough move here, rook d4. And after rook e6, the point is that we finally get our trade, and we get it under the best possible conditions, because look at black's position. It's just riddled with weaknesses. After takes, these pawns are going to get picked off for sure. I mean, white's probably going to go b3, king d2, king c3, a4, rook a8, and it's going to be a very easy win. So instead I played rook takes a7, and here what I missed was that after takes, e3, right, another key move, bishop takes e3, rook e6, that when I take this pawn, I figured, well, I have 3 extra pawns. Sure, he opened up the diagonal for his bishop, that's very nice, but I didn't realize that after queen a6, I've got all sorts of problems coming my way. I mean, rook c6 followed by rook takes c2 is coming. That's bad. Queen f1 followed by queen takes g2 could be a perfectly good idea. I mean, and if I try to go rook d1 stopping queen f1, rook c6, and I have to resign. If I go rook d2, I also have to resign after rook c6, because then after check on f1, I'm going to drop c2. So all of a sudden, this game that I had completely under control is off the rails. So I had to think for a long time here and sort of readjust and get back on the bull here. And they played queen d5, which I think is a good move, because I need to take some emergency measures here to defend c2, even if that means retreating all of my pieces and all the pain that would cause me, having worked so hard to activate them. But okay, it's what needs to be done. So now after queen a6, queen d1, queen c6, g4, queen c4, king b1, rook c6, and rook d2. And this was the whole point, right, of queen d5, to be able to regroup defensively and withstand this wave of attack. I'm down, what is it? I'm up 2 pawns, and it feels like I'm barely able to defend, right? That's how powerful the opposite color bishops are. Now, I don't think that black is able to add any more pressure, so I do think that white's position should be winning. And black played bishop e4. Yeah, I don't know, the computer says that trading rooks could be interesting if takes. I don't know, I feel like trading rooks just relieves the pressure. But otherwise, what do you do? Well, black played bishop e4, h4, and h5, right? If I can get to play h5, then you might have some king issues, maybe bishop d4, f3, and your bishop could be trapped. So after h4, black sacks a pawn in order to break up my pawns. This is kind of an interesting idea. And after bishop d4, f6. So now I'm up 3 pawns. And once again, the computer says, just forget about it. This is not, a position where the queens are helping. So we have to get the queens off the board. And I think in the Kalashnikov and in this variation of the French defense, it seems like in order to arrive at the right move, you need to understand where you're trying to get to, right? In the Kalashnikov, we're trying to get to this f5 with certain preconditions, right? Like no bishop on a3, no queen on h5. In these middle games of the Winawer, we're actually trying to get to an opposite color bishop endgame with rooks, right? That's sort of the condition, and obviously being an endgame without queens. So I played h6. This was already a little bit of time trouble, and after king takes, right, if g6, I'm just going to go bishop e3 and rook d7. If g takes h6, I'm just going to go h5, and you also have serious king safety issues. So you pretty much have to go king takes. And now after bishop e3, the only move is king g6. I was going to play, I think, h5, and now after king h7, probably just bishop back to d4 and try to figure something out. Kind of sloppy. Apparently better than h5 is just bishop d4 and f3 and try to make something happen on the g file. That's actually pretty interesting. But fortunately for me, my opponent played king h7 and blundered a checkmate in 2 moves. But in any case, I think it was an interesting game, not just because the opening went really well, but because I was able to understand the key relationship between the opening and the middle game, which is trying to set up these pretty much winning endgame positions. I mean, even if the material is even with the shattered queen side, white definitely has the upper hand. So anyway, these are 2 opening ideas that I was looking forward to sharing with you, and I hope you get a chance to use them. So thank you.